The morning of the proposal was as cold as the man who made it. A grey fog settled over Greystone Hall, draping the gardens and turrets in silence. Inside, the Duke of Greystone, Lord Sebastian Hawthorne, stood before the library window, his reflection fractured across the glass. He was 32 years old, with the bearing of a soldier and the eyes of a man who had forgotten how to hope. He had once believed in love. Once. That foolishness had died with his mother and been buried with the last warmth of his youth. Now there was only duty. Duty to his name, to the estate that had fallen into disrepair, and to the long-dead father whose voice still echoed in his mind. A Hawthorne legacy must not end with weakness. So when his solicitor reminded him that he needed an heir, not affection, Sebastian nodded without hesitation. "Find me a wife," he said simply, "a proper one. I require decency, lineage, and silence, not sentiment." The solicitor bowed. "There is one who would suit, my lord, Lady Evelyn Armitage, 23, well-bred, sensible. Her family's fortune is diminished, but her reputation is flawless." "Flawless," Sebastian repeated as though the word were a shield. "Very well. Have the arrangements made." A week later, in the gold-lit drawing-room of Armitage House, Lady Evelyn Armitage sat across from the Duke, her gloved hands folded tightly in her lap. She had heard of him, of course, London's most distant nobleman, a man whose temper was as quick as his charm was rare. Yet as she met his gaze, she saw not arrogance, but exhaustion. "My lady," he began, his tone measured and impersonal, "I will speak plainly. I am in need of a wife. You are suitable. I can offer protection, position, and stability. But I must make myself clear. This will not be a marriage of sentiment." The words fell heavy in the air. Evelyn blinked once, her heart steady but sinking. "And what kind of marriage will it be, Your Grace?" "One of respect," he said, "and heirs." He said it as one might discuss the purchase of land. No hesitation, no apology. She should have been offended, she should have refused. But her father's debts hung like chains around her family's name, and her mother's quiet, pleading eyes left her no room to dream. So she lifted her chin and said softly, "If it is respect you offer, I will accept it." A muscle twitched in his jaw. "You understand what you are agreeing to?" "Yes, my lord." He nodded once, rising from his chair. "Then the matter is settled." It was not a proposal. It was a transaction. No poetry, no tenderness, no pretense of romance. He bowed, she curtsied, and the deal was done. The wedding was swift and elegant, an affair of silk, lace, and silence. Evelyn wore white, satin trimmed in pearls, her beauty so gentle that even the priest's voice seemed to falter. Sebastian stood beside her, his hand steady as stone as he repeated the vows. "I take thee, Evelyn, to be my wife," he said, his tone even, devoid of warmth. Only the faint tremor in his voice betrayed that something human still lived beneath the marble exterior. "I take thee, Sebastian," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper, "to be my husband." When it was done, he kissed her hand, not her lips. The guests cheered politely, and the new Duchess of Greystone smiled as etiquette demanded, the kind of smile that hides fear behind grace. Their wedding carriage rolled through the fog toward Greystone Manor. Evelyn watched the countryside pass, fields veiled in mist, distant spires, and crows wheeling against the sky. Sebastian sat across from her, silent, his gloved hand resting on the window ledge. "You need not be afraid," he said at last, his tone more weary than unkind. "I am not afraid, my lord," she replied quietly, "only uncertain." He turned his gaze toward her, not harshly, but as if studying someone he could not quite decipher. "Uncertainty is natural," he said. "This marriage will be practical. In time, you will find comfort in it." She looked out the window again, her voice soft but firm. "Comfort, Your Grace, is not the same as happiness." He did not answer. The rest of the journey passed in silence, broken only by the rhythm of the horses' hooves. When they arrived, Greystone Manor loomed before them, vast, cold, magnificent. The great doors opened onto marble floors and echoing halls. Servants lined the corridor, bowing low as the Duke led his new Duchess inside. The house smelled faintly of cedar and loneliness. "This will be your home now," Sebastian said. "You may redecorate the east wing if you wish. I dine at 8. Breakfast is served at 7. The nursery wing remains closed until necessary." He paused, catching himself before saying, "until there is an heir." Evelyn curtsied. "Thank you, my lord." He nodded, already turning away. "Rest well, Duchess. Tomorrow you will meet the steward." And then he was gone, vanishing down the hall like a shadow swallowed by stone. That night Evelyn stood before the tall windows of her new chambers, looking out across the moonlit grounds. She could still hear the echo of his footsteps fading through the manor. She was no stranger to duty. She had been raised to fulfill it. But for the first time, she wondered what it would mean to live in a house built of rules and silence. The wind whispered against the glass. She placed her hand on her wedding ring, its gold cold against her skin. "You needed an heir, my lord," she murmured, her eyes glistening. "But you have married a woman, and she will not disappear quietly." The words hung in the air, a vow to herself, a promise to a heart she refused to silence. And though neither of them knew it yet, the marriage born of necessity would become the battle that taught them both what it truly meant to belong. The first winter at Greystone Manor arrived with more frost than welcome. The sprawling estate, with its marble corridors and endless staircases, seemed to breathe cold air through every crack. Lady Evelyn Hawthorne, newly the Duchess of Greystone, moved through its halls like a ghost in silk, graceful, quiet, and almost invisible. Her husband, the Duke, dined in solitude and worked in silence. He kept to his study, rising before dawn and retiring long after midnight, leaving only the scent of ink and brandy in his wake. He was courteous but distant, speaking to her with the precision one might use when addressing an unfamiliar servant. Evelyn learned to fill her days without him. She read in the sunlit corners of the library, embroidered by the fire, and wrote letters to her mother she never sent. The servants watched her cautiously at first, uncertain whether she would become another cold mistress of Greystone. But she surprised them, asking for their names, thanking them sincerely, even helping the scullery maid carry linens when her hands were full. "Her Grace is not like the last one," they whispered in the kitchens. "She smiles." But smiles were difficult to keep in a house built on silence. One morning, while exploring the east wing, Evelyn discovered a locked door at the end of a long corridor. It was the only part of the manor that seemed truly alive, ivy creeping through the cracks, dust shimmering like gold in the sunlight. She asked the housekeeper about it. "That is the old nursery, Your Grace," Mrs. Porter said, her voice cautious. "His Grace ordered it closed years ago, since before his mother passed." Evelyn hesitated. "And no one enters? No one dares?" That night, curiosity overcame obedience. She returned with a candle, her slippers silent on the marble floor. The door creaked open under her touch. Inside, time had stopped. Faded toys, an untouched cradle, walls still painted with clouds. She traced a hand over the cradle's edge, her heart aching with something she couldn't name. She didn't know that her husband had been standing at the far end of the hall, watching her silhouette through the flickering light. The next morning at breakfast, his voice was sharper than usual. "You entered the nursery," he said, without looking up from his newspaper. "I did," she replied evenly. "It was gathering dust. A room meant for joy should not become a tomb." He lowered the paper slowly. "It is my house, madam. You will not enter that room again." Evelyn set down her cup, her expression calm. "Then I shall have it cleaned, so that your house may rest easier." His jaw tightened, his control cracking. "You mistake kindness for authority, Duchess. You are here to fulfill a role, not to resurrect ghosts." Her voice was soft, but firm. "Perhaps it is not ghosts your house fears, my lord, but the living." He rose without another word and left the room. The doors closed, behind him with a sound that echoed through her chest. Yet later that evening, when she passed by the nursery, she found the door unlocked and freshly cleaned. The cradle had been moved nearer to the window, the drapes opened to let in light. No one spoke of it, but she knew. Somewhere behind his pride, something had shifted. The days grew colder, but Evelyn began to change the rhythm of Greystone. She hosted small teas for the neighbouring families, reopened the music room, and invited the local vicar's children to visit the library. At first, Sebastian tolerated it, though each act of warmth seemed to irritate him in ways he could not explain. But when she began visiting the village orphanage, his restraint finally broke. He found her one afternoon by the stables, her cheeks pink from the chill, handing out blankets to children who giggled around her. "Evelyn!" His voice cut through the air, low and sharp. "A duchess does not play at charity in the mud." She turned, unflinching. "Then perhaps the duchess must teach her husband what charity looks like." He stepped closer, his anger faltering as he met her gaze. "You defy me at every turn." "I live, my lord," she said, quietly. "If that offends you, perhaps you should have married a portrait." For a heartbeat, silence stretched between them, charged, dangerous. Then he turned away, his voice rough. "You will ruin yourself with this softness." Her reply was simple. "Or perhaps I will save you from yours." That night, as snow began to fall outside the manor, Evelyn sat by the fire alone. Somewhere in the house, she heard him pacing, the heavy, restless sound of a man battling something he did not yet understand. He told himself she was troublesome, reckless, too bold for her place. But her laughter haunted him. Her defiance warmed what years of solitude had turned to ice. When he passed her sitting room and saw her asleep in the chair, her face soft in the firelight, something inside him trembled. He stood there for a long time, watching the woman he'd married for convenience, and realizing, with quiet dread, that she had already begun to make his house a home. By the time winter surrendered to spring, Greystone had changed. Flowers bloomed again in the gardens. The servants smiled more easily, and the Duke, though still silent and proud, had begun to linger when she entered a room. He still said little, still guarded his heart like a fortress. But in the evenings he now paused at her door before passing by, his hand hovering at the frame. And though he always walked on without knocking, every time she smiled to herself, knowing he was there. The storm arrived without warning, one of those furious spring tempests that turned the countryside to silver and glass. Rain lashed the windows of Greystone Manor, thunder shaking the ancient walls. Servants hurried to close the shutters, and candles flickered in every corridor. Evelyn stood at the tall library window, watching the world vanish beneath sheets of rain. Somewhere deep inside the house, a door slammed. the sound of her husband's return. He had ridden out earlier that afternoon to inspect the western fields, though she had warned him the skies looked dangerous. He never listened, not to anyone. But as the storm howled, she found herself pacing, glancing toward the door with an unease she refused to name. When the great oak doors finally burst open, she ran to the entrance hall before her mind could stop her. There he stood, soaked to the bone, his hair dishevelled, his riding coat dripping onto the marble floor. His usually composed face was pale with exhaustion. "My lord," she gasped, "you could have been struck by lightning?" He met her eyes with a faint smirk, though his voice was hoarse. "It seems I was struck by your lecture instead." Her anger faltered. "You're freezing." "I'm fine," he said curtly, removing his gloves. But his fingers trembled as he did so. Without hesitation, she took his hand. "You're shivering. Come to the fire." He hesitated, pride flickering in his eyes, but she was already leading him toward the library. The scent of rain and leather clung to him, mingling with the warmth of burning cedar. She drew him near the hearth and gestured for him to sit. "I'll call for the servants," he murmured. "No need," she said firmly. "You've frightened them enough with that face." He gave a low chuckle, soft, disbelieving, and sank into the chair. For a moment, the room was filled only with the sound of the fire crackling and rain hammering the windows. Evelyn poured a glass of brandy, her movements quick but steady, then handed it to him. He studied her, the quiet authority in her posture, the compassion she tried to hide behind calmness. "You're not afraid of me," he said finally. She arched an eyebrow. "Should I be? Most people are." "Then perhaps," she said lightly, "you've simply surrounded yourself with the wrong people." He took a slow sip of brandy, eyes never leaving her face. There was no mockery in his gaze tonight, only weariness and something that felt dangerously close to admiration. After a moment, she knelt beside the fire, pulling off her gloves. "You'll catch fever if you stay in those clothes. At least remove your coat." He stiffened slightly, instinctively protective of his distance. "I'll manage." She turned, meeting his gaze with gentle defiance. "You needn't play the unfeeling duke with me, my lord. I've already seen you human." His lips twitched, part smile, part surrender. "When was that?" "When you defended the stable boy last week, after Lord Hensley accused him of theft," she said softly. "You pretended irritation, but you could not stand injustice. That was the first time I saw you real." He blinked, as if the observation had unsettled him more than the storm itself. "You notice too much." "Only what you try to hide." Their eyes met, a long, unguarded silence stretching between them. The firelight softened his features, revealing not the stern duke, but the man beneath, a man worn by loneliness and expectation. And as thunder rolled outside, she saw in him something she had never dared hope for: vulnerability. He stood abruptly, breaking the tension. "You're too kind for this place, Evelyn. It will ruin you." She rose too, her voice quiet but steady. "Or perhaps I'll ruin it instead." His breath caught, half a laugh, half disbelief. "You think you can change Greystone?" "I already have," she said simply. "There are flowers in the gardens again, laughter in the kitchens. The servants don't whisper when you pass any more. They smile. You may not notice it, my lord, but your world is changing." He stared at her, speechless. The crack of thunder masked the sound of his unsteady breath. Then, without warning, the window flung open, wind and rain bursting through the room. Evelyn gasped as the curtains billowed violently. He moved instinctively, grabbing hold of her arm to steady her. The sudden closeness stilled the world, the storm, the fire, even the sound of their own hearts. She could feel the warmth of his breath against her cheek, the tremor of his hand where it held her wrist. His voice dropped, rough and uncertain. "You'll catch your death standing there." "Then close the window, my lord," she whispered. But neither moved. The space between them dissolved, her eyes lifting to his hand still holding hers. It was not passion that drove them, but a kind of surrender neither could resist any longer. When his lips brushed hers, it was tentative, almost afraid, a question rather than a claim. She didn't answer in words, but her fingers curled gently into his coat, drawing him closer. The kiss deepened, not wild but aching, full of all the things they'd both refused to say. For a fleeting heartbeat, the storm outside mirrored the one between them. Then he pulled back suddenly, breath unsteady. "Forgive me," he murmured, stepping away as though the fire itself had burned him. She blinked, disoriented. For what? For forgetting what this marriage was meant to be. Her heart clenched. "And what is it meant to be, my lord?" He turned toward the rain-dark window, his voice low. "An agreement, not this." She swallowed, her voice trembling. And yet for a moment, it felt real. His silence was his confession. He left the room without another word, the echo of his footsteps fading into the storm. Evelyn stood by the fire long after he'd gone, her fingertips still tingling where he had touched her. She wanted to weep, not because he'd rejected her, but because for one fleeting instant she had seen the truth behind his walls. And that truth terrified her more than any distance ever could. The next morning, he was gone before dawn. But something between them had irrevocably changed. He no longer ignored her presence. He sought it quietly, without admission. They began to dine together again. Sometimes he asked about her day. Other times he merely listened to her speak as though learning a language he'd forgotten. He brought her books from his library, rare flowers from the conservatory, even joined her on walks through the garden. And though he never mentioned that night, his eyes told the story of a man who had been cold for too long, and of the woman who had made him feel the warmth of being alive again. By summer, the air around Greystone Manor had grown sweeter, softer, somehow alive. The gardens bloomed with colour, music returned to the drawing rooms, and for the first time laughter echoed through the halls that had once been tomb-like. But even in peace, storms find their way into hearts unguarded. Lady Evelyn Hawthorne had begun to glow in ways she could not explain, her steps lighter, her smile brighter. She had not yet told her husband, but she knew. A quiet certainty bloomed within her, delicate as the first petal of spring. She was with child. For nights she rehearsed how she might tell him, perhaps at supper, or beneath the stars in the garden where they sometimes walked together. But when the moment came, it was stolen. It began with a whisper. It always did. At the Duchess of Everleigh's midsummer fete, London's glittering elite gathered to exchange gossip under lanterns and champagne. Evelyn attended at the Marchioness's urging, radiant in sapphire silk, unaware that eyes watched her for reasons far from admiration. Among the guests was Lady Catherine Whitby, the Duke's former suitor, beautiful, sharp and cruel beneath her charm. Once promised to Sebastian, she now lived for the small sport of humiliating those who had what she did not. When she saw Evelyn speaking kindly with a group of children in the garden, her jealousy bloomed like poison. "She plays the benevolent Duchess well, doesn't she?" Catherine murmured to her companion, feigning a laugh. "I heard she spends her afternoons in the village, alone, visiting the orphanage. How touching and dangerous. So much time surrounded by commoners and certain men." The rumour caught like fire. Within a week, the Tun was ablaze with scandal. "The Duchess is carrying a child," one lady whispered, "but some say the Duke isn't the father." When the news reached Sebastian, it was late evening. He sat at his desk, the room dim save for the single candle burning beside a letter he had been writing. To her. A rare letter of tenderness. He had planned to tell her that she had changed him, that he could no longer imagine Greystone without her. But the knock at the door changed everything. "Your Grace," said his steward, bowing uneasily. "Forgive me, but there are rumours spreading." "About her." "Grace, about the child." For a long moment Sebastian said nothing. Then slowly he set his pen down. His voice was quiet. Too quiet. "Who began it?" "Lady Whitby, I believe." He rose. "Send for the carriage." Evelyn was in her sitting room when he found her, seated by the fire, sewing tiny white garments with trembling hands. When she looked up and saw his face, pale, cold, wounded, her heart sank. "Sebastian," she whispered, "what is it?" He stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "Tell me it isn't true." She frowned, confused. "Tell you what?" "That you've been visiting the village every week," he said, his tone tight. "That you've been seen walking with the steward's son. That the child you carry—" She froze. The needle slipped from her fingers. "Sebastian," she said slowly, disbelief breaking through her voice. "You cannot possibly—" "Tell me," he interrupted, his control cracking, "that this child is mine." For a long moment she could only stare at him. The man who had once kissed her with trembling sincerity now stood before her, like a stranger. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, too soft. "If you could ask that question, my lord, then you already have your answer." He flinched, guilt and pride warring in his eyes. "You've given me every reason to doubt." "No," she cut in, rising to her feet, her tears burning. "I gave you every reason to trust me, but you cannot love without suspicion, can you? You do not see a wife and only a vessel for your name." Her voice broke. "You needed an heir. And now that one grows within me, you question its blood? Tell me, Sebastian, is there any part of me you have not doubted?" He said nothing. Silence filled the room, louder than thunder. At last she turned away, trembling, but composed. "Then there is nothing left to say?" That night, before the dawn, Evelyn left Greystone Manor. She took nothing but a small bag and the locket her mother had given her. No servants, no carriage. The roads were empty, the world silvered with moonlight as she walked away from the only home that had ever truly felt like hers, and from the man who had taught her both love and heartbreak in the same breath. When the Duke discovered her absence hours later, he found only her unfinished sewing beside the hearth, a tiny baby's gown, half-stitched, waiting for hands that would never return. He sank into her chair, his hands shaking as he pressed the fabric to his chest. Around him, the house was silent again, colder than before, emptier than ever. In the days that followed, Sebastian scoured London for her. He rode through rain and mud, questioned every innkeeper, every carriage driver. But she had vanished into the countryside, and the city's whispers turned crueler still. When his steward brought him the truth, that Lady Whitby had fabricated the scandal out of envy, it was too late. "She's gone, my lord," the man said softly, "and she will not return." Sebastian dismissed him with a trembling hand, then sank to his knees in the empty nursery, the very room he had once forbidden her to touch. "I have destroyed the only light that ever entered this house," he whispered to the silence, "and I called it love." Outside, the rain began again, soft, steady, endless. And for the first time the great Duke of Greystone wept. The sea was her refuge. It had been months since Lady Evelyn Hawthorne had left Greystone Manor, and still she woke each morning to the cry of gulls and the sigh of waves outside her small seaside cottage. Gone were the silks and pearls of her title. She wore simple linen now, her hair tied loosely, her hands calloused from the work of ordinary living. Yet, despite the simplicity, she was at peace. Or so she told herself when the wind grew too quiet. She had given birth in the spring when the heather was in bloom. The midwife had smiled through tears and said, "A son, my lady." A son, the heir the Duke had wanted so desperately. The irony had not escaped her, nor had the pain. The baby was perfect. Tiny fingers that clutched her thumb, dark eyes that mirrored his father's. She named him William, after her brother who had died young, and because she could not bring herself to name him after Sebastian. Yet, when she whispered lullabies to him in the still hours of the night, she could not help but trace the shape of his father's face in his sleeping features. Her days passed in rhythm with the tides, quiet, tender, and painfully lonely. She sold sketches to travellers and gave lessons to the village children to earn her bread. To the villagers she was simply Mrs. Hale, a widow whose husband had died abroad. She never corrected them. It was easier to live as a ghost of truth than a spectacle of scandal. But when she watched her son toddle through the wildflowers laughing, she felt something stronger than bitterness. She felt hope, fragile but alive. Far away in London, Sebastian Hawthorne had become a shadow of the man he once was. The Duke who had commanded every room now avoided them altogether. His once immaculate study lay in disarray. Letters unopened, maps torn, decanters half empty. The manor was silent again, save for the echo of memory. The nursery door stood open now, sunlight spilling across the floor, mocking him with warmth. He visited it every night, unable to close it again. When word of Lady Whitby's confession reached him, that the rumours she had spread were false, that jealousy had guided her tongue, Sebastian had not spoken for an entire day. The servants whispered that their master had gone mad. Perhaps he had. He reread every letter he had written to Evelyn, unsent, sealed with wax and regret. Dozens of them scattered across his desk like fragments of a man begging forgiveness from paper. At last, he chose one. "My dearest Evelyn, I do not deserve the mercy of your eyes upon these words, but if ever you loved me, even for a moment, I beg that you read them. I was raised to value pride above truth, to trust no heart but my own. You tried to show me another way, and I repaid you with doubt. When I accused you, I did not merely betray your honor. I betrayed everything you had brought into my life: warmth, courage, and the meaning of love. I know nothing of where you are now. Perhaps you hate me, perhaps you have found peace where I could not. But if ever you wish to return, and not as my Duchess, but as yourself, Greystone's doors will never again be closed to you. And if you never return, I shall still thank God each day that for a brief and undeserved moment I was loved by you. Sebastian." He sealed the letter and sent it with his most trusted messenger, though he knew it might never reach her. It was less an act of hope than confession, a way to release what he had buried too long. But fate, as ever, is fond of irony. 3 weeks later, the letter arrived at Evelyn's cottage. The paper was worn from travel, the handwriting unmistakable. She stared at it for hours before daring to open it. As her eyes moved across the page, her heart ached with every word, not from anger, but from the depth of his remorse. When she finished reading, she wept, not loudly, but quietly, as one weeps when forgiveness begins to feel possible. Her tears fell onto the paper, smudging his name. That night, she lit a candle and wrote her reply. My Lord, once I believed love could change anything. Now I know it changes us, and that must be enough. You cannot undo what was done, and I cannot forget. But I no longer wish to hate you. Hatred requires energy that motherhood leaves no time for. Our son is well. He has your eyes and your temper. He laughs often, a sound that would melt even your frostbitten heart. I ask nothing from you, not even your name. But if you wish to be the father he deserves, then you will know where to find us. Evelyn. She did not seal it that night. She placed it on the table beside the cradle, watching the candlelight dance across the parchment. Part of her longed to send it. The other part, the one still tender from betrayal, feared the cost of reopening the wound. Weeks passed before she made her choice. One morning, while walking with William along the shore, she saw a familiar figure in the distance, tall, dark, and heartbreakingly familiar. The wind tugged at his cloak, the sea glinting behind him like a mirror of fate. He did not speak as he approached, nor did she. Their eyes met across the distance, and for a long, shattering moment, neither dared breathe. Then she saw it. Not pride, not command, but humility. He stopped a few paces away, voice trembling. I received your letter. I would have come even if I hadn't. Her eyes burned. You came to see your heir, then? He shook his head slowly. No, I came to see you. The silence that followed was heavier than the sea air. Then, as if moved by some small miracle, the child in her arms reached toward him, tiny fingers outstretched, innocent and trusting. Sebastian's breath caught. He took a hesitant step closer, then another, until he could see the boy's face. William? She said softly. His name is William. Sebastian's eyes closed, his voice breaking. He's perfect. Evelyn watched as he bent to his knees, reaching out as though afraid the child might vanish. May I? He whispered. She hesitated, then placed the boy in his arms. For the first time in his life, the Duke of Greystone wept, not for regret, but for grace. That night they spoke long after the stars appeared, about the past, about their son, about what forgiveness might look like. He did not beg her to return, nor did she promise she would. But when she finally leaned her head against his shoulder, the world felt still again. She had built her life from ruin. He had learned to kneel from pride. And in that small cottage by the sea, their story began again. Quieter, humbler, but finally true. The road to Greystone Manor looked different in summer. Once a cold stretch of gravel lined by bare trees, it now shimmered with golden light and birdsong. Wildflowers climbed along the stone walls, as if even the earth itself had decided to forgive. Atop the hill, the manor rose like a memory, familiar, yet transformed by the passage of pain and time. Evelyn Hawthorne sat beside her son in the carriage, her gloved hands resting lightly in her lap. The little boy pressed his face to the window, wide-eyed at the vastness of the estate. Is this our home, Mamma? He asked softly, his voice full of wonder. She hesitated. The word home caught somewhere in her throat. It was once, she said gently. Perhaps it will be again. Across from her, Sebastian, her husband, watched her quietly. He had changed. The man who once commanded the world with pride now carried himself with humility. His hair was touched with silver at the temples, his voice softer, his eyes unguarded. He no longer looked like the Duke of Greystone, he looked like a man learning to be human again. When the carriage stopped before the great oak doors, Evelyn's heart beat wildly. The house loomed before her, beautiful and terrible in its history. She had left it broken and betrayed. She returned not as a duchess fulfilling a role, but as a woman reclaiming her place. The butler opened the doors, bowing low. "Welcome home, your graces." Home. The word finally felt possible. The servants gathered in the foyer, their faces lit with cautious hope. Mrs. Porter, the old housekeeper, wiped her eyes discreetly as she curtsied. "It's good to have light in the halls again," she murmured. Evelyn smiled softly. "Then we must make sure it never leaves." They walked through the corridors together, their footsteps echoing over the marble floors. Dust no longer haunted the air. Sunlight poured through the tall windows. Every corner of Greystone seemed to breathe again. When they reached the nursery, the same room that had once divided them, Evelyn stopped. The door stood open, the cradle polished, the curtains drawn back to reveal a garden in full bloom. Inside, fresh flowers stood in a vase beside the window. Sebastian paused behind her. "I had it kept ready," he said quietly. "Not in hope, just in faith." Her eyes softened. "And faith brought you here?" He nodded once, emotion tightening his throat. "No, you did." In the days that followed, the house transformed once more, not with renovations or grandeur, but with laughter. The Duke and Duchess of Greystone were no longer figures of gossip, but symbols of something rare: redemption. Sebastian spent hours with their son, reading to him, walking the gardens, showing him the ponds and stables. The servants watched in awe as the once distant master knelt in the dirt beside his child, smiling. He had learned that dignity meant nothing without love, and love required humility. Evelyn, too, found peace in small moments. She played the pianoforte in the evenings again, her music filling the manor like the return of breath to lungs. Sometimes, as she played, she would glance at Sebastian by the fire, the man who had once broken her heart, now quietly mending it with every tender silence. And when their eyes met, the world seemed still. One evening, as twilight spilled across the drawing room, Evelyn found Sebastian in the library, the very place where they had first begun to understand each other. He stood before the window, watching the last light fade over the hills. "You still keep to this room," she teased softly, stepping inside. He smiled faintly. "It's quieter now, less haunted." She approached, her gown whispering against the floor. "You wrote once that pride was all you knew. Do you still believe that?" He shook his head, turning toward her. "No, you taught me that pride builds walls, but love builds homes, and I am done living behind walls." Her eyes glistened. "And if I told you I was glad I returned?" "I would tell you," he said gently, taking her hand, "that I prayed every day you would, but I never believed I deserved it." She smiled, tears slipping down her cheeks. "Then perhaps we both needed to stop earning what was freely given." He brushed a tear from her face, his voice trembling. "Evelyn, I once married you for duty. Then I lost you for pride. Let me love you now for everything in between." Her breath caught as he bent his head, his kiss soft and reverent. The kind of kiss that did not demand, only promised. Weeks later, London began whispering again, but this time with awe. "The Duke of Greystone and his Duchess are happy," they said. "He walks with her hand in his, laughs with his son in the gardens. The house that was once cursed with silence now rings with joy. And in Greystone, beneath the rose-covered arches, Evelyn often stood watching her husband and son play among the flowers, their laughter rising like sunlight through the leaves. One afternoon, as Sebastian lifted the child onto his shoulders, she called softly, "You've your heir now, my lord. Are you finally satisfied?" He looked at her, smiling in that quiet, tender way that always undid her. "No," he said, "because I didn't just need an heir, Evelyn. I needed a life." She laughed, a sound bright and free. "And you've found it?" He nodded, crossing to her and pressing a kiss to her forehead. "You gave it to me." That night, as the sun set over Greystone, they stood together by the nursery window, Evelyn, Sebastian, and their son. The family they were never meant to be, yet somehow had become. The baby yawned, curling in his mother's arms. Sebastian leaned close, whispering, "Do you remember what you said when we first wed?" She smiled faintly. "I said comfort isn't happiness." "And now?" She looked around the glowing room, the cradle, the laughter, the man beside her. "Now," she whispered, "I know happiness isn't comfort. It's forgiveness." He kissed her hair, his voice soft. "Then may we never forget it." Outside, the last light of evening spilled across the sea of Greystone's fields, golden and endless, like the love that had survived ruin to be reborn. And somewhere in the quiet, the house that had once been hollow seemed to sigh, content at last, alive again. Because love had returned home.